live, and if you can hear me, definitely give me the ones up. All right. So I'm just gonna start, and yeah, hopefully I can be heard. Um, I don't see any ones yet. I hope that's not a bad thing. Um, peace, Shakira Eden. Um, yeah, man. So 1 second here. One. Okay, cool. I could be heard. All right, just getting through my little messages here. Let me make sure I'm muted out. Oh yeah, I am there. Let me mute out over here. All right. Yeah. So peace everyone in the chat. Peace everyone who's gonna come in later. You know the usual deal, right? Okay, so I'm feeling it again. I know last time I was here, I said that you might see Brother El Karar in our next session, but he asked me to fill in again. So I was happy and glad to do it and to build with you. So obviously, our last session where we dealt with the Boule Society was a bit different. It kind of broke up a little bit what our good brother was doing in terms of his series. So I guess it just gives you a little divergent, sort of subject for a minute, and then we'll obviously come back to what our brother has been presenting to us. All right. So again, last session I dealt with the Boule Society, and similar to this session, it was pretty much last minute. I was like, oh, this is what I'll speak on, and then the same thing came up for this one. So I'm going to build on Thanksgiving because, and this will be for those listening later from the archives, we are approaching the season, I guess, of Thanksgiving. I actually thought it was today. It goes to show you like how in tune I am with these different days. But I was saying to myself, I said, isn't it? I don't know. I just kind of felt like it was today because everybody's been talking about it. But I was out and I wasn't getting the usual like customary niceness that comes. Like Happy Thanksgiving, man. People holding doors for you. So I was like, man, maybe it's not today. And I asked someone and they told me it's next strong. So um, yeah, I ain't really in it like that. So I guess this segment will be preparation for maybe the discussions that you may have next strong. I know that a lot of people don't care. A lot of people are just going to do whatever they're going to do with no sort of thought towards what their participation in certain things may mean. And I know definitely when we did the last segment on the Boule Society, I had people reaching out, was like, I'm not calling myself African anymore. Like, wow, like that's not happening. After you broke down the Scipio Africanus personality, I'm not messing with that. So I think that's a great thing because because in many senses, I know when I like to deliver something, I definitely like to give you something that you can apply immediately. And I would definitely say for something like so the title and thought of give thanks, forgot Thanksgiving was a thing. Yeah, good. Good. Yeah, man. That's Master Mental, like you just said that in the chat. Yeah, man. I forgot. I was just thinking, well, what am I gonna share? And I was like, man, maybe I'll do a Boule part two. I can go into that more. Just things were bouncing around. And then what happened was I was out, and it was a super long line, and I found out it was a turkey giveaway. So that's what made me say, I'll do Thanksgiving. You know, but because I saw the turkey giveaway, this was earlier. I'm like, oh, so it's Thanksgiving's today. I don't know. So yeah, man, I'm just pretty disconnected from the idea of it. But I wanted to like, for those who are still connected, let's address for a second, like, let's address for a second, a lot of what many of us have been told about it, right? So essentially, you had the pilgrims who came over from Europe, and they landed on Plymouth Rock, right? Plymouth Rock didn't land on us, or you know, and they were having trouble their first winter in what we call the new land, or what they called the new land, and it was some natives or Indians. We're just going to use the terminology a lot of us were given. One in particular by the name of Squanto, who taught them how to grow food and survive their first winter because they almost didn't make it, right? And then essentially, for some odd reason, the Indians just kind of fade to black after. Like we don't really hear much about them after that, and now it becomes just the story of the Americans. So many of us were given that story, and I know for those of us like myself who were young and knew that that was a lie, you know, it really can become very damaging to the brain when you're sitting inside of a, or the spirit really, when you're sitting inside of a classroom and your teacher is saying something that you know without a shadow of a doubt is not the truth, you know. But that's the story that many of us received, and then over the years, excuse me, there's been some warring against certain ideas around Thanksgiving, like should we celebrate it? Is it just another example of European conquest and colonialism? It's been lumped together with kind of Christopher Columbus and Columbus Day, and what should we do with that? And the thing is like it's so multi-layered that we could spend a long time really speaking about harvest festivals, you know, and how those have manifested themselves. And they're old, they're very old, you know. And one of the things to understand about, in particular, the parasitic elite or different versions of government, and I'm using that as a replacement for them and they. You know, sometimes we have to be careful about saying that all the time. You know what they doing, and they doing this and they doing that, but let's put a name to it. You know, different people throughout history, different forms of government. Um, Often the initiative there and the agenda is to take something that's already been done and then superimpose their own thing on top of it. So they don't really ever come up with anything, but they may take something like a harvest festival or like a seasonal festival and make it their own thing, right? So that's a very common thing. So there are some who may argue that, you know, well, we've always had Thanksgiving, quote unquote, and stuff like that. That's not true, but there are some who may argue it and may cite festivals that go back, you know, in ancient times. I mean, even in the Bible, you have the origins of what we now know as Thanksgiving, and that's when you had it later became the Feast of Tabernacles, but this was actually a feast where you would they sacrificed the 70 bulls. You gotta, when you read through the scriptures, and you'll see, like, when you count them, there was 70 bulls, and what they were doing was they were sacrificing a bull for each demonic energy that they were able to come out of the yoke from under. So this was really like a festival or an acknowledgement of the Nephilim. That's what this really was. And there were certain Nephilim that they called demons at that time who were ruling over the children of Israel. And when they were able to come from underneath that, these 70 different demons, they did a festival, and it became an annual festival. Um, but there's so much to this, man. Like there's so much. So I'm not gonna really, because Brother Lowe, when he's with you, he kind of does more of a historical perspective. So I'm gonna not touch too much on the occult aspects, but just understand that they are very much present, you know, in this particular celebration. But there's so many different angles to hit when it comes to this. So what I'm gonna do, I like last time, I wrote some notes because I didn't want to just come purely off the head. Um, but what I did notice, I'm gonna warn you now, because when I take notes for like segments like that, I still come off the head, but I just like I'm thinking like, okay, touch on this and touch on that, touch on that, and I realized as I was writing that I repeated a couple of things. So there might be some redundancies. So just bear with me on that, man. Yeah, just you don't need to know anything about my day, but yeah, there might be some redundancies on that. All right. So what I want to do, and again to keep it simple, and I'm gonna tell you why I want to keep it simple. Sometimes when you start talking about things like this, people will, if you share what they consider to be too much information, they'll immediately like, well, hey man, they'll blank out, they'll glaze out. Hey man, you know what? All that, I don't even get into all that. It's a day for me and my family to get together, tell jokes, and watch football. And that's because you said too much. So what I'm gonna do, because for those of you who may find yourself in a situation where you're trying to, what? Why you ain't you coming by? You know, I'm gonna try to give you some short. So what I'm gonna basically do is just start with a timeline. That's how I decided to do this one, and then yeah, we'll go from there. So willfully, you'll enjoy it. Yeah, just ride with me on this one. All right, so let's see something real quick. Um, Maybe I'll just leave that. Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna leave that. All right, so first thing to understand that the reason you have Thanksgiving in the form that you have it, in particular, this story about these pilgrims who came over with the hats with the buckles on the top and the penny loafers with the big buckles on the bottom, and the black and white shirts and all that, looking like, are you a minister or what? You know what I mean? Or valet? Why you saw that motif. I'm going to start with where that came from, because that's significant. A lot of things that we do when we really study, especially when they're put under like a spiritual religious guise, when we do the knowledge to it, a lot of times we realize like this was not spiritual at all. This did not have religious roots at all. A lot of practices that are done right inside of the church have political roots. They didn't have religious roots, but people do them anyway. You know, so um, first thing to understand that in the 16th century you had this beef between England and the Romans, right? The Roman, we'll say Rome, England and Rome, and the beef was essentially between Henry VIII and the Roman papacy, or the Roman Catholic Church. That's where Thanksgiving started. Okay, as the Thanksgiving in the form that you may know it today, right? So it was a beef between Henry VIII and the Roman Catholic Church. That's the first thing I understand, and I'll explain to you what that was. So essentially, Henry VIII, he was a big, obese, nasty kind of guy. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, right? And he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon so he could marry Anne Boleyn, right? And at that time, I mean, really, still, the Roman Catholic Church did not condone divorce, especially among royal bloodlines. See, that's the key. That's just, I'm not going to get into the occult thing so much, but there's this his beef with the crown's beef, because the crown, when you're dealing with England, always think the crown, because the crown essentially is what's controlling all of these different occultic rituals. It's the crown. When you see that orb and that scepter, it's got some deep roots to it. But again, like I said, I'm trying to keep it more historical than metaphysical, or not even metaphysical, because this is real stuff. I mean, less occultish. That's the word I meant to use. So, because metaphysics are real too. Before somebody jumps in the comment, ooh, we got him. So, he had a beef with the Roman Catholic Church because he wanted to get rid of his wife. It was these marriages are important because of what they represent for the royal bloodlines, and he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn because Catherine of Aragon had not given him a son, so therefore had not really given him a male heir. And they said, no, no, you. This is what it is. You married to Catherine, and you're gonna stay married to Catherine. So Henry VIII was not feeling that at all, and there was some other aspects to it, but that was the problem. That was the beef. That was the core of it. So what he created was well, let me say this before I say that. You got to understand that at this time, the Roman Catholic Church, this time too, in this day too, ruled the world. Okay, so there was this merging of that Roman Catholic Church and the monarchy, and it was pretty much one, but it was everything was done at the behest of these bishops, and the Pope. That was they ruled Europe. So for England to now go to war, and they were fighting to go to war. It was like going against the world, going against the world government almost, if you could imagine. And Henry VIII did this just because there was a girl he liked. She was young too. There was a girl he liked, and he wanted to be with her, and they wouldn't let him. So now he's ready to go to war. Okay, so what happened? Uh, there was a movement created called the Protestants, right? Many, and I'm going to use some terms that a lot of you might be like, yeah, I've heard that before, but I'm showing you the root. And understand, for anybody coming in late, we're talking about the origins of Thanksgiving, right? So you might listen and be like, what does Henry VIII have to do with Thanksgiving? Just ride along, and if you ride along, it's going to be so clear. Okay. So they established this Protestant movement, right? And essentially, the job of the Protestant movement was to remove the Roman Catholic influence from England, and really to remove the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church out of England. Like that was what they did, right? Or what they were doing. Um, so at that time, Henry the Eighth. Put my notes here. I don't have that many notes actually, but I know they're out of order. So because I was just jotting down little ideas as I was going, so I know they're out of order, but it's not that many. So Henry the Eighth, basically what he did was he renounced the Roman papacy, which is the Roman rulership, and he declared himself to be the head of the Church of England, but not only the head of the Church of England, but the head of the clergy of England. So you got to understand what that means. The Pope is the ruler of the world at this time in terms of people's thinking. So for Henry the Eighth to renounce that connection, and there was other things associated with that because he also cut economic and political ties. That was the key, because you to this day the Vatican, the Roman Catholic Church is the wealthiest business in the world, right? That's not me just talking. Like, you can look that up. You know, they have buku money. You know, they got enough money to blow up the planet and probably build a new one. You know, so for him to renounce the Roman Catholic Church and then establish himself as the ruler of this new church, he was equating himself, making himself equal with the Pope, saying, I run the world, right? And on top of that, I'm not giving y'all any more money. All right, that's going to come back around, because you got to understand, and I'm not going to get into the occultism too much, I promise you. All of this is about money on a human level. Remember, when you're dealing with satanic agenda, Satan means material, right? So Satan, or the human mind, or the human brain, excuse me, is connected to attachments and materialism. So when someone says, oh, that's a satanic agenda, don't necessarily, even though they may be saying it thinking of a person in a red suit with a pitchfork, you don't think that. Just understand that satanic agendas are money agendas, okay? So rituals, satanic rituals that you see. I mean, there's so many rappers right now that they're satanic soldiers, you know. But it's all about money on a human level, and then on an occult level, it's something different. But we're gonna like I said, I'm gonna go easy with the occult stuff. Um, so he renounces the papacy, and again, remember, all of this is because he's trying to get a divorce from Queen Catherine, so he can marry Anne Boleyn. Um, so he then, like I said, creates this new church, and that becomes what you know today as the Anglican Church. It was the Anglican Church back then, but that became the Anglican Church, and he appointed himself as the ruler over the church. So he wasn't. It wasn't like he was a minister or or ex bishop or pope. He just said, "I'm gonna start my own church, and I'm the head of it, and we're gonna go to war with the Catholics." You know, so that became the Anglican Church, and he put a archbishop over that church by the name of Thomas Thomas Cranmer, and he became the archbishop of the Anglican Church, right? So at that point, he made Parliament in England pass laws that supported the concept that the Church of England would be the official belief in England. That's important, right? So I establish my own church, I make myself the ruler of the church, and then I make the legislative body say that this is the official religion of this place, right? So there's a lot that followed that. He became, or um, he made himself to be termed as the supreme head of the church, the supreme head of the church, right? And what happened is that now, under that new church body that he's now the ruler of, the archbishop granted him his divorce. So now he was able to marry Anne Boleyn, with that divorce. So Anne Boleyn then gave birth to Queen Elizabeth I, right? Very important. Just remember, very similar to like what I did with the last one with the Boule. And I was like, yo, just when you hear me say these names, just write them down. Same thing. Just write them down. Um, yeah, you're learning something about European history, which you should. It's important. But you also learn. We're ultimately talking about Thanksgiving here, right? So, and all of these characters are important. That's why a lot of times when I'm doing segments, I like to write my notes from the head instead of like looking up something real quick. Because if I write it from the head, I know I'll keep it simple. You know, so I say that to say that every name that I'm condensing it down to the important players and all of this. So um, there was also a son that was had by the name of Edward the Fourth, and Edward the Fourth was actually poisoned when he turned 16. So when he was poisoned when he turned 16, um, Elizabeth, she was the one who took over. And no, I'm sorry. I screwed, I messed the names up a little bit. So let me go back actually to Henry. So basically, because he created this church and said that this is the law of the land now, he persecuted anybody who practiced anything other than what he was given, which was basically like anybody who still is coming with remnants of Catholicism. And persecuted is not like I'm taxing you. It's like killing you, maiming you, putting you on stakes. Like it was that bloody. It was that crazy, right? So anybody who spoke against the king or spoke against the Church of England was considered to be guilty of treason. Okay, so if you had a religion already, which you probably were Roman Catholic before, and if you tried to maintain the vestiges of being a Roman Catholic, um, you would now be considered someone who was committing treason. Okay, so um, many people were hung. He was disemboweling people, disemboweling them. He was maiming them. Like he was going crazy with this, right? So eventually, Henry the Eighth, he dies of syphilis and a bunch of like he was just a walking, just like junk toxic heap. You know what I mean? Like you ever remember Fraggle Rock? You remember the junk heap in Fraggle Rock? Henry the Eighth was basically a big obese junk heap. Like he was a dump. So he died. He eventually died of syphilis, and he had a bunch of other diseases and stuff that were going on with him. And when he died, his daughter succeeded his son Edward. Edward the I think I said the fourth, but I think it was Edward the sixth, who was murdered at 16. He was poisoned. So then Mary came in, right? Um, nah, it's all good. It's all good, Aki El Kara. It's all good. Um, Now here's the thing with Mary though, where it gets interesting. Mary was this was a child that he had with Catherine of Aragon before he divorced her and got with Anne Boleyn. So Mary was a devout Catholic. Like she was all about Rome, and her whole thing was she now once she came into power, she wanted to reunite the bonds that her father, like all of those different Protestant Reformation acts and stuff like that. She wanted to X that and renew, change that, and get back with Rome again. Create those or rebuild those political ties, rebuild the economic ties with Rome. So, um, and keep in mind at this time, her mother, who was Anne Boleyn, Henry the Eighth had already beheaded her. Like I don't know, he wasn't very chivalrous. He didn't know how to treat a woman. He just cut her head off. Um, so now what was happening is that there were some Protestants who were still kind of alive and moving at this point. But what Henry did was, I'm sorry, what Mary did was she murdered like off the rip. She murdered over 500 Protestant leaders, and including the Archbishop Canterbury, right? And I know you thinking when I said Archbishop Canterbury, not the chocolate. That's Cadbury. That's the Cadbury egg. Canterbury. I'm playing. But so yeah, so she murdered the Archbishop of that new church, and she murdered a bunch of people. She was so wow that she was known as the Bloody Queen. That's how like insane she was, and that's actually where you get the. If any of you drink, or you might have heard this drink before, called the Bloody Mary. The Bloody Mary is a drink where you take vodka and you mix it with tomato juice. The Bloody Mary actually got her name from um, Queen Mary, right? She was the Bloody Queen. She was known as the Bloody Queen. All right, so like I said, a lot of times it's very interesting the things that maybe we involve ourselves in or do and don't realize some of the roots are, and especially when you're working from the West, a lot of things you do have really savage, roots to them because savagery is actually celebrated in the West. That kind of goes to the last podcast I did on the Chief Yuya podcast, speaking about anger, and a lot of times how we celebrate people who are quick to anger. That's a Western thing. We celebrate our violent and bloody generals and presidents. You know, um, so there were certain Protestants who survived. And let me say this too: Mary married a person who was a tutor. And the reason why I'm throwing that name out at you, there was a series that came on Showtime, I want to say, called The Tutors, and very, very, very good series, very good series. So if you want to understand some of these things that I just broke down to you, I would suggest that you go watch that series, The Tutors. It was either The Tutors or Tutors, or I don't know. But tutors, if you look it up. But they did a really, really good job. They did a really good job on that segment. Of course, some of it was off historically, but they still did a good job. So you could, if you want to understand someone that's a bit more, and you're more of a visual kind of person, you could check that out. The Tudors got a couple of seasons. You won't be disappointed. Yeah, El Quran. It's a really good show. You know. So at this point now, you have Protestants who were still kind of revolting under Bloody Mary Tudor, and some of them survived her her reign, if you will, and eventually, it was Queen Elizabeth the First, who came into power after Mary, and Queen Elizabeth was a different kind of energy. For one, she was considered a virgin, right? This is actually where you get the name of the state, Virginia. Virginia was named after Queen Elizabeth the First because Queen Elizabeth the First was called the Virgin Queen, the Virgin Queen, right? So in steps Queen Elizabeth, and now she brings people back to the Protestant, even though she ain't right. That's why I had to say allegedly. This is what she was known as, but everybody lies. And when you get up to these levels and what these people do, and they're all a bunch of liars. Um, so, uh, like I said, now the people are Protestant under her reign. So you have that Protestant energy coming back forth once again. After Elizabeth, who's the person who succeeded Elizabeth was an individual known by the name of James Stewart. James Stewart. So James Stewart is who we know as King James. Okay, like when you say the King James Bible, he came after Elizabeth the First, right? Now I know you still like, what's it got to do with Thanksgiving? I got you. Just go for the ride, okay? Because the truth is, what we, well, not we, because I don't do it, but what people do for Thanksgiving ain't got nothing to do with some of those harvest festivals or the Feast of the Bulls, which is really what it was. When you go back to biblical times, where they would sacrifice those 70 bulls. But so yeah, man. Yeah, Stewart is a famous Scottish clan. James Stewart is an interesting character. I don't want to get too much into the occult aspects, but there's an occultism there, and there's also a misunderstanding of his actual race. You would assume he was in Europe, he was a king, but it gets deep with him. Um, so at that time, there were Protestants. Now we got the church back to a Protestant place, but there were a bunch of Protestants who felt like the church had still too much Roman Catholic influence. Because you got to remember, under the reign of Mary and all of that, she tore down what her father established and brought that Roman Catholic dogma and influence back into the church environment. So there was a bunch of people who were like, this isn't what it's supposed to be, right? So they started rebelling against the dogma of the Roman papacy, if you will. And out of that came who we know to be as the Puritans, because their whole thing of being a Puritan, if anyone of you have ever heard of the Puritan church, this is where it came from. Because they were trying to purify, which was basically scrub the Roman Catholic influence out of the Protestant church. Okay, so that's where you get the actual Puritan groups. And there were three main groups that came out of um, the Puritan movement or the Puritan church. That was the Episcopal Church, or the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, and it was another church called the Congregation of England, right? And these churches are still here today. Like there's still the Congregational Church, the Presbyterians, and the Methodist Episcopals, right? So they eventually, obviously, made their way over to America as well. But we haven't even gotten into, like, we're in America yet. We haven't gotten that far yet. For right now, we're still just dealing with how it all started. Just giving you a timeline. Now, I don't expect you, a side note, for you to be sitting. I mean, maybe, hopefully, you can to sit at your. For those of you who do Thanksgiving, to sit at the table and say, "All right, let me tell y'all the real story. It all started with Anne Boleyn," and if you can, that'd be great. So you might have to find a more condensed way if you feel like sharing it. Like I said, most people don't even care. They say they care, but at the end, but they preparing their Thanksgiving meal right now, um, because of whatever reasons. I'm not gonna start calling people names because I stupid idiot. This is Lowe's or El Karaz space. So I don't want to bring my Chief Yuya savagery. But y'all know, like the nice Chief Yuya, that only lasts about, how long did I go last time? I think 11 minutes, and then so I don't know. I'm 35 minutes in, but I ain't start really talking yet. All right, so I'm just giving you the basics. Um, so at this point, by the 17th century, we're now in the 17th century, under the reign of King James, you had this group that were known as separatists, right? And those separatists were, again, because they wanted to separate from the Church of England, because they felt like, again, not only did the Church of England have too much Roman Catholic influence, but that it wasn't as pure as it was supposed to be. It goes back to that Puritan concept. And they kind of felt that there was an anti-Christian sort of concepts that were being pushed through those particular churches. So they started to be persecuted by King James. King James was a wild man. I mean, this was a dude who stood up and was like, "Yo, we doing a new Bible." This, which became the 1611 King James Bible, and he was like, "We doing a new interpretation from Hebrew to Greek." And there's so many different things with that. But I want you to understand that Bible was not created because King James just stood up and was like, "You know what? It's time for us to do the righteous work and put this book in English so everyone can read it." It wasn't. It wasn't that. You know. So he was persecuting these Protestants, and to the point that they had to flee. They fled out of England, and the first place they went is Holland. Now they never really tell you that. So you hear the word persecution, like, oh, the Pilgrims. Like, I'm going back to the original story that many of us were told. I don't even remember all of it, but I know they fled. America was started by people who were fleeing religious persecution. Right. That's what you particularly told. Not totally true. You're not totally true at all, because they were they went to Holland. They were fine in Holland. Nobody was persecuting them in Holland. But this is what, remember, when you're dealing with satanic rituals and things, it's about the money. So what happened was that when they went to Holland, they weren't able to make the money, because you got to understand that there is a colonialist sort of agenda, especially at that time. Whereas wherever we go, we have to subjugate the place and make money, right? That's almost like our religious purpose and right to go do that. So they go to Holland, and it's like, we good over here. Like, don't come over here with that. And not only that, was that Holland at that time was a very kind of worldly sort of place. So what they felt was like, there was two reasons why they ended up leaving Holland. They never tell you this part though when you're a child. Say, oh, they just left England. Like, they just left England, got on the Mayflower, and came over to America. And which wasn't true. There was two boats, the Mayflower and the Seaburn. And the Seaburn ended up like it wasn't roadworthy, basically. So they ended up having to turn around, go back to England, and then just brought the Mayflower over. So there's so many parts of the story. But there was two things with them going to Holland. One, they felt that the people there were too worldly, and they became concerned about the people's effect on their children. They felt that their children were going to become worldly. Because remember, these are Puritans. Follow though. It gets interesting. And the other reason was because they couldn't make, like, if we can't go somewhere and subjugate somebody, what we gonna do? Like, work, farm, make our own money? No. So that was the other issue, right? So they then petitioned the king to receive basically like a licensing. It was like a license to colonize. So what that meant was that they were given permission from England to go like wherever they landed to establish their own colony. Okay. Now the reason that's important because once they filed for petition to colonize, um, colonization doesn't mean just, hey, it's like someone being in our news saying, hey, Chief, can I have permission to start a chapter where I live? Right? I mean, say, sure, yeah, go start your chapter, do your thing. You know, plant that our new flag, you represent it. But what it means is that, especially for the Church of England, they sanction now all of the things that are necessary to colonize a place. That's the key. So it's not just we can go there and set up villages, but if anybody's there, we're getting an okay from you to wipe them out or do whatever we got to do to establish this colony for you. That was the key. So that became a financial thing because that means we can enslave people, we can steal whatever they have, and of course, we're going to send tribute back home. It's called taxes. We're going to send tribute back home, but ultimately we could do whatever we want, and we're cleared in the eyes of God because we file. It's like just filing for any type of paperwork because we received this sanction for colonization. That's why they left Holland and came to the Americas. That's why they were not persecuted in they didn't come here. Remind us, they didn't come here because they were fleeing from religious persecution. They went to Holland because they were fleeing religious persecution, and then came here to make bread. All right, make money. Um, so what happens at this time now? These people eventually became who you know to be as pilgrims. Now, there's some debate on this one, and the debate they were the pilgrims, but there's some debate as to what they called themselves. So, in some of the early historical accounts, they knew they were pilgrims. They referred to themselves as pilgrims when they first went to Holland, because to go from England to Holland, that was the pilgrimage, right? And then there's some scholars who, but it doesn't really make sense, but either way, there's some scholars who say that they just called themselves Puritans, and then later historians called them pilgrims. Either way, they're the pilgrims with the buckles on their shoes. Okay, so it don't really matter. Either way, these are your pilgrims. Now, hopefully, you're seeing the line how it started from Anne Boleyn. This pilgrims were created because somebody wanted to divorce their wife and have sex with this young girl, this teenage girl, Anne Boleyn. That's how you got pilgrims. Okay, hopefully you were able to trace down, right? So there's a couple things I want to touch upon going forward, right? So um, they started to. The first thing I want you to get was this, right? So we're often told that in 1620 the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock, right? Which is a complete lie. They were closer to the area known as Cape Cod, and what happened is I'll get into that. There's a couple things that happened, but that's a lie. They did not land in Plymouth Rock. That's just something they made up later because it sounded cool. All right, but here's the other important thing that you need to understand. They were coming to Americas, the Europeans, since the 1500s and trying to establish colonies. In fact, the first place that they tried to establish a colony was the area that we know now as North Carolina. And what happened was the natives, they couldn't mess with them. the natives drove their butts right back out. It wasn't happening. But see, the thing is, when you come from a poor place, and you really have a mission, you coming back. And so there were several attempts that they had made. When I say they, I'm saying these early European travelers. This is before the Puritans, before the Pilgrims, right? There were several attempts for them to make it here, to get over here, make it pop for them, right? And so that set the stage for what happens next. That's why I want to give you that part. So eventually they ended up being able to get a foothold in Virginia, and that's where they established what we know as Virginia today. But that's where they were able to establish their colony. But they had tried in North Carolina already. But I mean, you ever been in North Carolina, man? Some of them natives, especially them Lumbee down there, they wow. They shoot a lot. They be shooting all the time. You ever make it down there past over by Pemberton and Pembroke and and Lumberton and St. Paul's, that area, that area, yeah, the natives, that's the Lumbee, because it's the Lumbee River there. So that's the nations that are over there. So they couldn't make it happen in North Carolina. Ended up running over. Yeah, exactly. North Carolinas ain't no joke. They backed them right back on their boats, and they went back and tried it again, and they were able to make it happen in Virginia. So that's another part of the story you're never told, right? This is all before 1620, right? And I'm going to show you why that's significant. So that Virginia colony was established in 1607. 1607. This is 14 years before you, or 13 years before your 1620, right? And you got to understand too the significance in that, because Virginia is a slave state. It became a slave state, and a lot of people never understood how Massachusetts was implicated in that. But you'll understand. So now what happens? We're at 1620, September of 1620, to be exact, and you have 102 people. They head out to set sail for the Americas, right? And I know a lot of times, again, when the story is told, it makes it sound like, because you try to figure out, like, okay, there was Christopher Columbus, who he went to the Caribbean, of course, and then these people went to America. Like, it was just his two trips. And the Mayflower, like, they was the first ones, and like, oh, that's a lie. They have been coming back and forth here, been enslaving natives, been killing natives. Like that was already happening, right? It's significant. I'm saying it because I want you to understand. You're gonna understand things that happen later. So in September, they head over. There was 102 of them, but out of the 102, 35 of them, 35 were Puritans, or what you would know as Pilgrims. 35 of them, right? So again, much different than a lot of times which you're told in school. Like it was like 2,000-3,000 of them, and they came here and set up colonies. It was 35, and then that, I'm gonna tell you how that went, because essentially they landed in what we know as Provincetown today, right? And they came upon okay, they came upon the Wampanoag, right? So a lot of times, again, they just tell you the Indians, which is so disrespectful. The name of that nation was called Wampanoags. So they came upon the Wampanoags, but this is what they did when they came to Provincetown. This is what they did. Because remember, they have the sanction to colonize. So that means wherever we go, we just do whatever we want. You got to remember that part. The very first thing these early European travelers did, 35 were pilgrims, and then the others were just folks coming over and trying to make it happen. But why were they coming? The very first thing they did was they started grave robbing. First thing, they started grave robbing. So what they were doing was they were going through the graves and getting food and getting anything that they thought was pretty or interesting. They were just taking them, right? That was the first thing that they did. So what ended up happening was the Wampanoag, the warriors, chased them out of that area, and that's when they went over to Plymouth. That's when they went to Plymouth. Now, if you study some of the history, when you get a little deeper, right? Because it's like levels, there's levels and layers. They'll tell you that they came to that area first, and what ended up happening was well, no, because you remember they would bury them with corn and things like that. But we're gonna get to the savage part. We ain't done, Sister Yafe. We ain't done, right? They will tell you that they left and went to Plymouth because there was no fresh water. So they came to that area, like it's like around Cape Cod area, and there was no fresh water. So then they sailed over to Plymouth. Bull crap. That's not what happened at all. And there is so many. You can look and you can speak to Wampanoag elders. They'll tell you exactly what happened. Like this is not even secrets at this point. It's just mysteries. They went there, started grave robbing, which makes sense, right? Because isn't that what they do? What do they do in Kemet? What do they do in Zimbabwe? What do they do in Nigeria? They take all the artifacts, all the stuff that they like. They take. What do they do in Iraq? Take all the artifacts, all the things, all that Anunnaki stuff, and all that alien technology. They just go, just take it. Because we have a paper here from the King of the United Nations that says that we're allowed to be here. That's what they did, and those Wampanoag warriors, they was not having it. Chased them up out of there, right? So that's where Plymouth Rock came from. When they tell you like, oh, and it wasn't no rock. You know, they dragged a rock, literally. They dragged a rock to that area. This is how much they wanted to create a story that made them seem better than what they really were. And you remember, 35 of these people were the good ones, the church folks, the Puritans, right? So at that time, when they sailed to Plymouth, they were met by Wampanoag elder called Maciot. Very important character, Maciot. They never tell you. You probably never heard that name. They don't talk about Maciot. But if you kick it with Wampanoag, they'll say, I've kicked it with Wampanoag. Went to powwows and hung out and everything, you know. So he's a known. He's like our Malcolm X. Or well, yeah. And I would say his son, Philip, is like our Nat Turner. Okay, but I won't go too far. So, like I said, they go to Corin. It was an area known as Corin Hill today. I'm giving you the modern day, so you know, and that's where they stole everything. Then they go over to Plymouth. They meet Maciot. Now Maciot was the leader of his tribe's confederacy. So he was not only a leader, he was like a warlord. Now this is what's significant. Maciot was the one who helped them and taught them how to survive. Squanto as well, but I'm gonna get into who Squanto was in a minute. We're gonna get to Squanto. But I know a lot of y'all, if you remember when we were children, they taught us about Squanto and he taught them how to plant corn on it. I'm explaining what that really was. So Maciot, the reason that he helped them was not because he had any love for them. At that time, because you remember what I told you earlier, they have been traveling for years, for over 40 years, to that area, decimating the people. They have been decimating the people. Like Aki El Karar just said, they wiped his people out. Right? So they have been decimating the people. They have been engaging in biological warfare. They have been enslaving the people. They have been enslaving them. This is over 40 years. So Maciot, at that time, the Americas, the tribes were decimated. A lot of them were being killed off. They were dying from disease because they called it when the first settlers arrived. You won't get this in your history books in school, but if you kick it with native elders, there's a term like how those of us who know better don't necessarily say the term transatlantic slave trade because when you say transatlantic slave trade, there's an implication that these people were slaves and not people. Like these people were enslaved; they were not slaves. So we oftentimes will say the Ma'afa, which is a word, it's a Swahili word that means Holocaust, right? So we'll say that like the African Holocaust or the Ma'afa. So there's a term that the natives use, and it was called the Great Death. The Great Death. This was a time that was signified when those early Europeans came to the land because everybody started dying. Everybody started dying. Again, it was the diseases. You had it was a lot of wars, um, and then you also had the enslavements. So they called it the Great Deaths. So this is what happened when Maciot saw these new people come to Plymouth. His idea was to create an alliance with them because they were also because now they're starving for resources because the other people came. So some of the tribes were warring with each other who weren't warring before. So he figured these people look different because you remember 35 people on this boat were Puritans. They were pilgrims. They looked different. They moved different. So his idea was let me create an alliance with them and maybe they can help me with the other Europeans who came and caused all of these problems. That was his idea, right? Um, he didn't know. He didn't know who he was dealing with, you know. But that was why. So when you hear the stories about the early natives helped the pilgrim, that's what it was. It wasn't that they want these people were already coming over here and these were the bringers of the great death, right? That was known. These people bring death. But these are their people. They look a little different. Maybe they can help us with their brothers, basically. You know. So it was really an act of diplomacy. Now at that time, the the pilgrims drew up a document. It was a pact where it was basically saying that their job and their duty in the Americas was going to be to bring the light of God and create a civilized place. So it was a pact that 41 men signed. 41 men signed this Maciat is the spelling. Thank you, Aki El Kara. You gave him the spelling. Appreciate that. But it was called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact. And that was basically you gotta read between the lines, but they basically was saying, we about to take this place over. And the people who were there, we're gonna subjugate them culturally, spiritually, and every other way. So um one of the important things with this is that we're dealing with the first cold winter in North America, right? And of course, there wasn't enough food. They didn't have the proper shelters. It was cold, so forth and so on. So at one point, remember I told you there was only 35 Puritans. At one point, their numbers shrunk down to 7. There were only 7 of them here. Okay, so again, when you're told the stories, you think it's like hundreds of them. There was only 7 of them, and this is where it gets interesting. So like by spring after that winter, over half of them were dead, and um, their thing was we're going to make it happen. Now let's get into Squanto for a second. Squanto was an individual who previously he had traveled to Europe. And this is why he was able to speak their language. He spoke English. And what happened was that when he was coming on his way back, he was captured and enslaved. So at that time, it was like the vogue thing in Europe to have these native slaves. And so that's why he was able to interoperate with these people. So again, I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but the lies be so blatant. So a lot of times when you see again the cartoons, it'd be like me Squanto, you white man. Like it wasn't like that. Like this man spoke English, and many of them spoke Hebrew, and there were so many people here. I mean, and let me make something clear too. I'll get to that. I'll get to that. So Squanto, he steps in. And again, he had been in England for years. He was educated. Now, when he was in England, he was just moving around. He was educated in English. He could speak English. It was when he was coming back when they got him. Okay, and when he came back, he when he finally was able to come back, he found out that all of his tribe, all of his tribe had died from disease. So you look at movies like The Last Mohican with Mel Gibson. It's so disrespectful, but his whole tribe was wiped out from the great death brought on by these early settlers. So now, like I said, now we're looking at the fall of 1621, and you had a governor by the name of William Bradford, and he called for a 3-day feast, which some people say that was a Thanksgiving feast. But and you'll see pictures a lot of times of like the natives sitting down and the women are serving food. That's not what happened. What happened was that they were shooting guns. The Europeans were shooting guns, and the natives heard the guns and came over, and then they ate. It was only men there, and some of the men ate together, right? And that later became what they tell you is a Thanksgiving feast. They sat there because it was very tense, because these are the people who were just killing all of our people, but they were trying to really check their temperature and establish alliances. Now, I want to say something important about that, right? Um, the very first like recognized what we called Thanksgiving was in 1637, and that Thanksgiving happened on the banks of the Mystic River. If any of you have ever been to Connecticut, there's an area called Mystic, Connecticut, right? And what that was a celebration of a massacre. Okay, so um, at that time, there were a bunch of natives who were massacred, and they celebrated it with this feast in 1637. Okay, so what's interesting about the Thanksgiving piece is that, like, remember I told you it's layered, right? So we can go back again to the fest of the bulls, where they would have it on the mountains at the gates of hell. And the gates of hell, whenever you see words like that in script, I'm not going to get to, don't worry, people who just went to history. They're talking about entrances to the realms of the Nephilim. So they would have these sacrifices there, like, yeah, we're not under your bondage anymore. That's what it really was. It was no different than Mizraim or Egypt. They weren't under the bondage of Pharaoh. Pharaoh wasn't the issue. They could have fought. The issue was the Nephilim who were there. That was the issue. That's the gods, quote unquote. That's who they were. They had an issue with. So I'm going to get into something for a second. And of course, in 1863, we're fast forwarding. Abraham Lincoln created that proclamation where he said that we should celebrate this, continually, like make it official. Um, but really, what it was about was there was a lot of war unrest because of all of the massacres. So he said in 1837, hey, let's get together, let's have this day where we can commemorate like us trying to unify. Because he knew like, yo, these people they getting it on. Because you gotta remember too, what was happening at this time was that they were moving the natives onto what they call plains towns. And plains towns were concentration camps. That's what the plains towns were. They were concentration camps. So there was so much that they were doing, so much that was happening. Now I'm gonna tell you something that was extra interesting. I don't mean to laugh. So there's a book called The General History of Virginia, and it's different volumes, right? So the one that I'm thinking about is volume 4, I believe. The General History of Virginia, and there was a guy by the name of Captain John Smith, and I've read a lot of these books about the journals, basically, of a lot of the early people who came up with this. They're just so interesting because, I mean, I like firsthand accounts. And what you get out of places like National Geographic and the BBC is total garbage. That's why even when you look at the commercials for National Geographic stuff, It's like it could be a commercial for ESPN. You know what I mean? It's the same type of propaganda, and even National Geographics originally that came out of the Church of England. That wasn't their name early. They changed their name. You know, so this was always they were propaganda machines, right? So that's why a lot of times when you look at the BBC or you look at National Geographics, they spend most of their time debunking. Most of their shows are about debunking things that you might find. You know, it's not really new or real information. So I like to read some of these journals when you can get a hold of them because nobody reads them. That's why they don't tamper them too much. But John Smith, sorry, I'm getting a lot of notifications. John Smith and Captain John Smith, um, he spoke about, and I paraphrased because I didn't grab my book before I wrote this, but he basically said was that you think of John Smith from Pocahontas as you should. Like I said, every name I say look up. This is where it gets interesting, Sister Yafe. Because you remember they were dealing with a famine. They were dealing with a famine here. And he said that the famine that had gotten so bad that the poorest of them went to the bodies, they went to the grave sites of the natives, dug them up, and stewed them, cooked them, and ate them. And they first did it with one. He had an account where they did it with one. It was one native man who had died. They went and dug him up, and he talks about the herbs that they used to stew his body in. They boiled him. They said they boiled his body. And then they put herbs in it and they stewed him and then they ate him. And then, if that's not enough, they went after his wife. His wife was still living. They went after his wife. And what they did was, he says that they took his wife, they powdered her. They powdered her, and then they cooked parts of her. So they didn't even necessarily like kill the woman. They cut off some of her body parts and ate her. Okay, these were your early Europeans who came here. Now you got to understand something that's important in this too. When we're talking about savages, so whenever they mention savages in text, they're talking about indigenous people. So I want you to understand what savages mean. At one point, their own people called them savages, which was interesting because remember, it was 7 Puritans left. The 7 Puritans was like, we here, we ain't going anywhere. And the remember there were other ones. The other ones went back to England because they got some of the things. They got slaves and stuff that they want. And then when another shipment came and saw the Puritans that were here, they remarked on how they had become savage. I'll explain. It gets deep because of what they were doing. But I want you to understand something that's very important when you're visualizing all of this. The early natives that were here had high melanin content. So you might be thinking what you see in cartoons or the movies or whatever, or The Last Mohican, right? But these are people who had high melanin content. So you got to think about that for a second. When they're digging them up and eating them, or eating some of them alive, right? You have to just, if you could think about some of these Scottish rites, you think about some of these rituals, we got our hands on the gods, and we're going to eat the gods to survive, right? So this didn't just necessarily happen in the States. If you ever read J.A. Rogers' book from Superman the Man, he talks about the famines that were in Europe, right? And it became very common. This is during the 16th century still, that people were eating human flesh. You know, people who were poor, and it was very common to drink blood out of human skulls. That was a regular thing, right? Now, there's a book that I pulled for a second, but I didn't get a chance to. Well, I could have did the quote, but I knew I had it paraphrased. But you could look it up. The author, the name of the book is The Story of Mankind, and the author is Hendrik William Van Loon. Hendrik William Van Loon. This is a book I liked. Um, and he talks about his early European ancestors, right? As he's speaking about them. And he says that they lived in the great wilderness of Europe and that they were learning new things in the great wilderness. And that in due time, he says in due time, they would have given up their savage ways and developed a civilization of their own, but there was an end that came to their isolation. And then it's just one sentence in the book, and he says they were discovered. Now, for me, I always thought that was a very interesting passage out of the book because it's like that's how y'all describe everybody else. Like they just living in the wilderness, being savage, have no civilization, and then you discover them, and then you provide civilization. But here, we have someone speaking about, Hendrik Van Loon. He's speaking about, no, my ancestors were savages living in the wilderness of Europe and had no civilization, and then they were discovered. By who? I know by who, but remember we talked about Thanksgiving. Um, so so when you fast forward and you're understanding these these savage or cannibalistic acts, man, everything is so timed. Even the release of Netflix Dahmer, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, it's all timed. Around, oh man, there's so much I could say. I want you to think about even the biological warfare that happened, because you remember the Puritans. Man, I got a lot of reminders. The Puritans show up, all right, and before the Puritans show up, there's a pandemic. There was a pandemic here before the Puritans showed up, and then that heralded kind of like a new era, if you will, right? Because the goal is not necessarily to completely wipe people out. See, that's the thing that you're taught a lot of times is off. Like, yeah, the Europeans came here, they wanted to kill everybody. No, they didn't. They didn't want to kill everybody off. Or they tell you like fake stories like about the Mayans. Oh, they just disappeared. When they got there, couldn't find not one of them. None of them. They didn't disappear. They were subjugated. When the people came here, they weren't all killed off. They were subjugated. That's the important thing. Because you got to think about the Mayflower Pact. The Mayflower Pact wasn't we're going to kill everybody. We're going to civilize everybody. They're going to be here because why? We need slaves. They were selling slaves already. And again, high melanin content. So you or we oftentimes are given this image that they go to Africa, they bring the slaves to America or to Cuba or to Brazil. You're never told they come to America and bring the high melanin content blacks, Negroes, Hebrews, and take them to Europe. Because when you start to really use some common sense, you realize some of this it just can't make sense. You didn't have enough people here to kill everybody. It just wasn't enough of you. Right, exactly, El Quran. It doesn't add up. That doesn't make sense. So there had to have been a high amount of people who were already here. You didn't bring all them people over here. Something's off in the numbers. But we're talking about Thanksgiving. I don't want to get too crazy. I want to touch on the turkey for a second. Right? So where's the turkey come from? Now, so what happened was that when they first came here, they saw a bird that was here that resembled what they call the guinea fowl. In Europe, there was this bird by the name of the guinea fowl. Where did it get its name from? From the place where it was brought from, Guinea, Africa, Guinea. So it was called the guinea fowl. And when they came to this place, they saw a bird that resembled the guinea fowl. And because back in Europe, they called it the turkey cock. I know some of you just laughed. I know you did. The turkey cock. That was its name. Okay. Um, and that has Moorish roots. It's another thing. It's a Moorish thing actually, and that's why the red crown even it's a Moorish thing. But anyway, it was called the turkey crock. It was really after the Turks, and those birds were bought from a Kibalan. You see, y'all laughing. I know how y'all are. You're so childish. So the turkey cock was brought over, and like I said, it was brought from Guinea. So when they first saw it, you had turkey cocks and turkey hens. They said, "Oh, that's the same turkeys that we had," but it wasn't. It was buzzards. It was buzzards from the vulture family, and they began to kind of use that buzzard as their symbol, and ignorantly. So say it again, right? Yeah, I was gonna see what y'all was gonna do. You silly. So ignorantly, um, they called these buzzards turkeys, or rather, turkey cocks. Okay. Um, Now, what I always personally found very interesting about that is that bird symbols, even in ancient Kemet, even in modern day America, the eagle, birds are always used, especially whether it's royalty or different, occult societies, to signify spirituality. It's the aspect of flight that represents the spiritual content that's represented in a certain thing. But they chose a bird that can't fly. The turkey. Turkeys don't fly. And I always thought that was very interesting. It was almost like a very interesting foreshadowing. Like these are not a spiritual people. Because look at even the first of all, they got the wrong name for the bird. They call them buzzards, which it's a vulture. You're not supposed to eat a vulture. You don't eat. You could eat a guinea fowl. Even when you read the Levitical laws, we could eat guinea. Guinea is fine. You can't eat vultures. You see, or like what it was called, the buzzard. But that's what the actual turkey was. It was a buzzard. It was a vulture, and they named it the same thing that the guinea fowl was. And I know these birds well because I used to grow. I used to keep guinea. I had like over 50 something guinea fowl on my land at one point. They're really good to get rid of mosquitoes. If you got enough guinea fowl on your land, you won't have no problem with. They eat mosquitoes. They love, but they're ornery and they're very tough. They're not like chickens. You just grab them by the legs. Come on, guinea fowl. They're loud and they're African. They will fight you. They are definitely African. So I wanted to just kind of cover that a bit as far as these different. Um, yes, eating the turkey on that day is a ritual. It's absolutely a ritual. It's absolutely a ritual because it's signifying a massacre, number one, but it's also talking about the Moors in Turkey. Like that's a whole nother thing. So just the turkey alone, because they were eating deer meat. When they first got together, they what happened was they didn't have enough food when they had this feast, and they sent the warriors out to go get five more deer. So even so when they include some of these other foods and eat this, eat that, a lot of times that's a part of the ritual that he wasn't eating that. You know what I mean? Um, but again, and there's so much more. There's so much more to this. Um, because we didn't get into the King Philip Wars. Now King Philip was the son of Maciot, And what was so deep about King Philip was that I'm not going to get into it too much. It's a lot here. We're already well over an hour. Um, he he went to war with these people. Like I said, he was our yeah, you know him, right? He was Nat Turner. He was not playing. He was making it clear he was Mastiot's son. And what happened was that eventually he he got caught, and when they finally caught him, they beheaded him, and then they took his body and they put it on a spike, and that was a warning to all the natives to let them know, like, we're not playing with you. Now, what was yeah, they cut his body up, exactly. Now, what's so interesting again is because that's not the image you're given. You're given the image typically, even like the cowboys, the Indians are savage, and we just trying to come here and live and escape religious persecution. No, the Europeans who came up, well, wow, because remember that first meal, they heard gun, they were shooting guns. Like this is how they were celebrating. This is how they were celebrating that feast. They're popping shots in the air. The natives heard it and came over. So they already came with that kind of energy. And then when they signed that Mayflower Pact, this is Puritans. And what happened, which was so interesting, when they were eating people so much here, when the people left it and came back and saw them, like I said, that's when they called this place the land of the savages. They were not referring to the natives. They were referring to their own people because their own people were eating the bodies of natives so much that they were just digging them up out of the ground. So some of the natives even changed their burial rites to burning their bodies because the pilgrims were eating so many of them. You don't get that story in school, right? That's not. But their own people were journaling this, like, yeah, it was cold, ate the cold body up, put the herbs in it, secret herbs and spices, and ate it, So yeah, when they killed King Philip, or in the Philip Wars, the King Philip Wars, that those lasted like over like 30 years. Now, what was interesting about those, the same area where they disemboweled and hung King Philip on this pike, who was again Mastiot's son, he was a revolutionary, is an area known now. You could look this up. I think there was a documentary about it. I'm pretty sure. Um, but it's an area called the Bridgeport Triangle. The Bridgeport Triangle, right? So those of us in the north, you've probably been, or if you've driven to Massachusetts and whatnot, you've driven through Bridgeport, Connecticut, all those areas. So you know some of those areas. Um, but this is an area that's where there's a lot of paranormal activity. They've had Bigfoot sightings. They've had the miniature Bigfoot. What do they call it? The Pottajat sightings. They're like small Bigfoots, and what they do is they lure you into the swamps. They've had missing people go missing, and there were these different. There was a document episode on King Philip here. Okay, cool. Um, and they've had these satanic churches that were run out of that area called the Bridgeport Triangle. But there's been a lot of like people going missing and craziness and stuff like that that's come out of that area where they did this thing. I've spoken on that before when I've spoken about certain massacres. I'm not going to mention the name of the massacre. I don't want to send off any alerts, but um, whenever there's any kind of massacre, always do the research on the area. What was there before? What were you doing? Like Massachusetts is named after a First Nation there that was called the Massachusetts. That was a tribe, where and they were doing craziness there. So that's why there's a connection between Massachusetts and Virginia. Because these were people who were in cahoots with each other, if you will. But like I said, there is so much killing and so much bloodshed that happened around the founding of this place by the people who were, again, these Puritans, which became known as your pilgrims. And there's a lot that I left out because this could be way longer. Like even the dates. Why is you have so many holidays that fall on Mondays, but Thanksgiving is always a Thursday? Why is it always Thor's Day? And Thor again is connected to Jupiter, the celebratory deity. Why do they always choose that Thursday? Why not a Monday? Or like Christmas is December 25th. Don't matter when it falls, it's gonna be December 25th, right? So there are a lot of extra things that we could get into that I'm gonna try to not, because again, like I said, we're a good way in. Um, but that's essentially your timeline of what you know to be as the openings of Thanksgiving. It all began with a beef that King Henry VIII had with the Roman Catholic Church because of of him wanting to have sex with someone and marry this Anne Boleyn, which was really a violation of the crown. Which, when you violate in the crown, you violate in bloodlines. Bloodlines are very important. Um, but him violating those lines and then establishing himself as a religious dictator, if you will, eventually led to people coming here and doing what they did. So again, I don't celebrate it, and I knew we don't celebrate things like this. We don't we don't deal with these type of holidays, if you want to call them that. And I know people use them as an excuse and say, well, it's just a time to get together with family, eat food, some good food, and if that's, I mean, do whatever you feel like doing. You know, at this point, we're at a stage in our development where you know what you're doing. You know what you're doing. So, um, I have I'm wise enough not to be sitting here talking to people who don't care, right? And I teach the same thing with others. Like, don't even waste your breath, because most time people don't care anyway. Don't waste your breath. But there are those who do, and who maybe have said, I'm not going to celebrate this because of what it represents, but maybe didn't necessarily have the timeline, and now they can kind of stand a bit more intelligently and stand on something a bit more secure when they say, no, I'm not going to involve myself in this or that because I have a better understanding of what it is, man. It's not, it's the harvest festivals, many cultures have harvest festivals. It's not about that. But the actual idea of Thanksgiving and that actual celebration comes from a very savage sort of root, a very savage sort of roots. And it's rife with cannibalism, maiming, hanging, slavery, and that celebration in 1637 was actually celebrating a massacre. That Thanksgiving, it wasn't celebrating like, oh, we survived. It was celebrating, we look at how many people we killed. Look at what we did here. Let's celebrate that. But again, I want to just reiterate that don't get caught up in the wokeness of it, because woke people usually be the most uninformed. And the woke narrative will always be, yeah, man, it's always just these white men, white supremacy, and it's deeper than that. You know what I'm saying? And you lose the deeper thing that's happening when you just focus on white men going all around the world causing all this havoc. Is deep, and that may be part of what may be happening, but you also have to put it into the context of the times. This is a time when people were colonizing people. Like, this is just what it was, and different people had a different way to do that, right? So you can't necessarily look at today's European and say the same exact thing. Is today's European now? What's interesting? I wish I could find this site. I was literally looking at it earlier today. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I thought it was so interesting because right um, when I went to go live, I just remembered this. So there is some of you may be familiar with this, right? There's a company now that sells celebrity meat. I don't know if you're familiar with this. And what they do is they take certain celebrities, they allow their bodies to be broken up when they die. They allow their bodies to be broken up to be sold. So you have this. There was one company called Bite Labs. Bite Lab, but I think that their site is down. Something happened. BiteLabs.org, and there's another one. I think it's called Eat Celebrity or something like that. And essentially, what they do is they take the meat of the, yes, meat, MEAT, like here's my forearm, take some of it off, and they mix it with animal meat, and you can buy it, and you buy it to eat it. So let's say if you're a big Tom Cruise fan, and Tom Cruise is signed up with this, and he transitions. You can look it up. Like, is his body for sale? And you can buy it, and then they mix it with other kind of meat, and then you can eat it however you want. So it's very interesting because it's like disgusting. Oh my god. Yeah, well, yeah, Bite Labs. But there's something's wrong on the site right now, and I just thought it was interesting because I was thinking about it today, right before and then right when I went live, I was like, oh yeah, the celebrity thing. So it was. I said, hopefully I don't forget. But cannibalism, it's on and popping. And the thing that you got to understand is that people were committing cannibalism in Europe because they were starving, and then they came here and committed cannibalism again because they were starving. You have to kind of ask yourself, like, what's to prevent them from doing it again? Just like, again, to establish this paradigm here in America, they had to wage a pandemic first. A lot of times, remember like when 2012 came, 12, 12, 20, 2012, and everybody said it's going to be the end of the world, right? And I said, I did a show, I think that night, and I said, it's not the end of the world as we know. I said, no, I think that was the title of the show, The End of the World as We Know It, something like that. And I spoke about a paradigm shift. And I said, well, the clock is really off. It's really not now, right? And I spoke about the year 2000. And I said, you might even see it as 2021, not 2012. Consider the things that happened in 2021 in terms of the subjugation of the people, the scientific tyranny, right? And what happened before that scientific tyranny and the subjugate. I mean, you put the world on house arrest. House arrest. Stay inside, don't come outside. You have places like Sweden where they were going door to door, the police knocking on doors. And if they knocked on your door, they had these apps where if you said you was home within a certain amount of minutes, you had to come to the door of your house to prove that you were in the house. House arrest. How did they put the world on house arrest? And then it's been different ever since. How did they change the whole paradigm of the world? There was a pandemic first in 2020, which now created the paradigm of 2021 that we are still dealing with. So one of the things that you'll learn when you study these stories like about Thanksgiving is that the toolbox does not change. They keep using the same exact toolbox. And if you're not a person of memory, you won't even remember. You won't see it when it's coming. Like, wait a minute, wait, hold on. I know what you're doing. I know what you do. You did this in the 1600s. You just doing it. It's just just sounds a little different, but it's the same exact thing. Because we're having certain bloodlines just doing the same tactics over and over and over again. All right. So I just wanted to share that. And again, like I said, right, the manual is the same manual, just a new edition. Exactly. Just a new edition. Just recycling the same old techniques that Sister Yafe just said. So, like I said, I just wanted to share this, and there's so many different angles I could come at you. Like I said, we didn't even get into the occult part, right? Because we can go deeper into that turkey part. The occult part is really deep, or the fact that it's always on Thursday. There's a lot to it. There's a lot to it. And maybe El Carrar, or maybe if he needs me to cover back, maybe I'll do a part 2, whatever. I doubt it, but I might, because there's a lot more to it, and I could speak about this for hours upon hours. But I didn't want to take up so much of your night. But willfully, you have a little bit more background, a little bit more standing, and like I said, if it's something you celebrate, you're damning yourself. Right? It's just like people who travel to the Bridgeport Triangle. You can go look it up if you want. End up missing and this and all these different things. Yeah, because you can't just be hiking through an area where they massacred thousands upon thousands of people, and you just hiking, or or build a school on top of a native burial ground, and wonder why somebody comes in there and goes crazy with assault rifles. Stupid. Genocidal, suicidal, homicidal, you know, piano recital. No. But so that's what I'm just saying. Like, these things are all connected. That's all I'm saying. So willfully, you were able to get a little bit more background, but just understand that when you involve yourself in a lot of these rituals, because traditions, like if somebody says like, well, why do you do, oh, it's just our tradition. I just want you to understand that tradition is a sterilized way of saying ritual. That's what a tradition is, a ritual. So, oh, it's just our tradition is what we've always done. It's just our ritual is what we've always done. Well, you're ritualizing to what? Because when you ritualize, you are emulating something that the Elohim did. That's a ritual. So ritualizing is always sending energy up, right? So you want to kind of figure out like, well, what is, because it's different between a ritual and a sacrifice. Where sacrifice, you're looking for something to come down. You're sending something up, but it's to manifest something here. But a ritual is to manifest something there. So when I'm engaged in this turkey eating ritual, and everybody, because you got to understand that when there were celebrations before, like the Feast of Bulls or whatever, nobody celebrated any of this stuff in their house. When you had rituals back in the days, whole cities would come outside and they would meet in like the town square, and they would ritualize out there with everybody else. So how does that transform itself? Right, exactly. El Quran said they did it outside. Exactly. These things were done outside. So now, how does it change itself? Is it something different? Because, well, we just inside eating, and we just inside, watching the game. Does that change anything? You see? So it's just important to know what you're doing. That's all. Know why you're doing it, and who you may be engaging with on a deeper level when you're doing it. So for me in particular, I'm not particularly interested in engaging with the seven Puritans who were here eating people. I'm not trying to be a part of that storyline, because there's a karmic response that comes for that. So I don't want to be in the middle of your karma. You know what you did. You going to deal with that. Your school's going to get, because one of the things that you keep noticing, hopefully, as bad as the schools are in the hood, and as pervasive as guns are in the hood, why don't we have any of that stuff happening? You don't never hear about school in the South Bronx, right? School in South Philly, no, or North Philly, really. Chicago school, no. Mm-mm. That should tell you something right there. So I don't want to be in the line of your karma. That's you. That's all you right there. So just think about that when you're engaging in these things and you're sneaking off and doing it. I'm speaking to our new members. When you're sneaking off to doing it and playing it off, oh, I just went to go see some family. Stupid. I'm sorry. I said I wasn't gonna say nothing, call any name. Sorry about that. That's slip. I meant to say it inside. Like it was inside that I cried. It was inside that I insulted you. No, but I just say it's stupid because it's so dangerous. And you sneaking off for dumb reasons when you could just do it another time. There's other days that people are off. Election days, people are off. Ask yourself, why is election days always on the Tuesdays? Because is that the archetype of war? Are we going to war? Is that why it's always on Tuesday? But yeah, man, I told y'all. I mean, I lasted for a while. Though. Y'all laughing. I did pretty good on this one. All right, I did pretty good. But those are things that you want to kind of think about. Like, why am I sneaking off to go do this thing, and I'm putting myself within a spiritual or karmic trail just so I can eat a bunch of stuff that I got no business eating, and sit around and ritualize myself by watching this sport, which is another church, or having dumb conversations. Because if you truly are consciously aware, you know you can't talk about anything with your relatives other than the weather. You know that. And that's how it always starts. And then when you get a little liquored up, the liquor start flowing around the table. That's when, hey, what y'all think of chemtrails? Oh, it is. Here we go. Hear the fork strike. Here we go. Here we go. Y'all notice it's been foggier lately? Where's all this fog coming from? Y'all ain't past that. You past that, cuz. Y'all ain't noticed all this extra fog lately? I think they hiding something. Or yo, did y'all read that article that NASA just found a superstructure inside of the Milky Way? That's true. I didn't make that up. But nobody's talking about it. They just found a superstructure inside of the Milky Way, like behind it. They don't know what it is. They're saying they don't know what it is yet. A superstructure. Told her sister Ahava says no cannibal celebration here. Okay, that's good. This year you're gonna do something different. Thank you. That's good. Spread the word. Because some of these other years y'all was doing that. But let your friends know. Let them tell a friend to tell a friend. Let's not. We got so many other things that we can do. Like even when you look at the Feast of Tabernacles, that's a celebration that we not being ruled over by these demons anymore. That's something that's worthwhile. That's worthwhile. Unless you're still being ruled over by those demons. But there's so many other times and days that we can celebrate, and you can still eat a lot of that nasty food that you got no business eating if you want to do that. But when you're aligning yourself with the energy flow of certain rituals that are harmful to your spirit, then it doesn't matter how much retribution you try to do in other areas, you're hooked. You're in it. Especially when you begin to obligate and guilt yourself yearly. Oh, Christmas is coming. What am I going to tell my family? Thanksgiving is coming. I'm just going to turn my phone off. I mean, keep your phone on. Keep your phone on. When they call, what are you calling me for? I remember it was a couple of years ago. I don't know what she was thinking. I don't know. I stopped doing this stuff when I was 11. I didn't participate from 11 forward. I was out. Um, I stopped doing the Pledge of Allegiance in second grade. I think I only did it like 3 days, because the school I was at before was a private. It was all black school, and then my parents put me in a white school. I don't say white school, but public school. And I can't say white because there was only two black kids in the school. Somebody posted. It was funny. A couple of years ago, somebody posted. One of my classmates from back then posted our second grade picture on Facebook, and some of my people who know me as Chief, they saw it because I guess she tagged me in it. And you see me, I'm the only one in there. So a lot of people didn't know that about me. That yeah, that's what I grew up around. Um, but yeah, second day of class, second third day of class, because we didn't have to do the pledge in my old school. We used to sing the national black anthem every morning, and I was like, the pledge. I didn't even know it. I'm trying to figure. And then there was one girl. I remember her first and last name to this day. Was still cool. I speak to her once in a while. She was a Jehovah's Witness. So I'm looking around the class, and she's the only one not doing the pledge. So I asked her. I said, "Why don't you have to do this?" She said, "I'm Jehovah's Witness." I said, "Oh." So I told the next day I didn't do it, and the teacher said, "Oh, you supposed?" I said, "I'm Muslim. We don't do this." This was second grade, and never did it. And anything after that, I said, "I'm Muslim. We don't do that." So there's always opportunities to remove yourself from the line of fire, from the BS, and you should take those opportunities, because we are a celebratory people. There's a lot of things we got to celebrate, man. A lot of things, man. um, it doesn't have to be this foolishness. All right. So with that, I'm gonna head on out, man, and I will that this was adequate El Karar. I'm, like I said, I'm the Anu floater, so they gave me another opportunity. Last session I did the Boule Society, so you can definitely check that out. And if you need me again, I'll come back in with something else. All right. right. So I didn't check the chats. So I think y'all were just giving like a lot of throw up emojis when I was talking about the cannibalism. So I don't know how to translate those. But yeah, I don't think there's too much in the chat other than ew, um, the Indian Wars was just in the West. You know what I'm talking about? Or wasn't just in the West. Yeah, I do know what you're talking about. And there was so many of them, man. Woo, so many of them. So many treaties were broken. Good gracious. Um, okay, yeah, there's a lot here. So, uh, I'm sure it's all right. I'm sure it doesn't. I'm sure no one's in here like telling me, Chief, I'm locked in the trunk somewhere. I saw you was going live. Help me. I hope it's none of that. All right. So, if anything, man, everyone be well, and yeah, thank you for tuning in. All right. So we'll see you next time.